Welcome to the Women in Business and Finance interview series. This series is co-hosted by the Center for Financial Markets and Policy, Georgetown Women in Business, and McDonough Women. In this series, Georgetown alumni are interviewed about their careers and experience as women in finance and business.
We're here today with Isabelle Moses, Chief of Staff from Faith in Action. Thank you very much for joining us and taking the time to speak with us today in this event honoring women in business. To kick us off, could you just briefly tell us a little bit about your journey and career path and what led you to the role you are today, and a little bit about your background?
Sure. First of all, thank you so much for the invitation. It's wonderful to be with you as a triple Hoya. Actually, I did an undergrad in the School of Foreign Service and then graduated from the MBA program, and also have a coaching certification from Georgetown. So I am a loyal and proud Hoya. So glad to be with you all today. So I guess I'll start because I grew up in San Francisco, and my parents are executive directors, or my dad's retired now, but my parents both ran organizations, and that I didn't realize until later in my career journey how influential it was to kind of grow up with that regular set of experiences of watching them kind of run these organizations that were very civic oriented. My mom runs like an arts advocacy organization, and my dad ran a city agency. So I always kind of spent a lot of time in my childhood going to a lot of meetings, and the reason I bring that up is that when I was later in my career and as an undergrad, I was really interested in the nonprofit sector. So my first job out of Georgetown was at the Calvert Foundation doing socially responsible investing, which now we call it impact investing. And that was a really great experience to kind of see how business could be used as a tool for change. And so one of our investments was in microfinance. And so I became really interested in how microlending could really transform communities. And so as a result of that, I became a Peace Corps volunteer, and I was in West Africa and Cameroon, and had a really interesting experience working inside a microfinance bank. And at that time became in some ways an internal consultant. I really was interested in the internal processing of like why people were using manual processes when they had computers. And I was like, oh, okay, if I train folks on how to use the computers, then we can have, greater efficiency. Everyone can go home earlier. And so I like to think that my consulting career was born kind of in that experience, but there was a lot I didn't know, which led me to go and get an MBA at Georgetown. And then after that, got a full-time job with Accenture in the corporate strategy practice, which was really interesting opportunity to learn more about how Fortune 500 companies operate. And I worked there kind of during the time of the economic downturn. And so ended up leaving kind of in the middle of the financial crisis, and then transitioned into government consulting, and then eventually into nonprofit consulting. And in my very first job at Community Wealth Partners, where I ended up working for several years, I was asked to coach executive directors. And I didn't realize how much I would draw on my parents' experience as leaders when I was asked to start working with these leaders of nonprofit organizations. And a lot of the work at that time was on business planning and things like that, monetizing different earned income streams and supporting nonprofits with greater sustainability. And I just really fell in love with working with leaders and discovered that I have a real passion for supporting leaders to live into their visions and aspirations for their organizations and communities, and ultimately for society. And eventually worked with an organization, Faith in Action, that is my current employer, but they were my client first. And I had the opportunity to partner with the leadership team on organizational questions, and became really inspired by the mission of Faith in Action, which is to create beloved communities around the world and to inspire a society that really works for everybody. And one of the things that I've learned in my career is that we can use a lot of business skills to support nonprofits, but there's also ways in which capitalism has not served particularly communities of color. And one of the things that Faith in Action really does is advocate to legislators and folks at the local, state, and federal levels to to change policies and practices so that our society is better able to support success for everybody, and in particular in communities of color. So, and that includes things like increasing funding for criminal justice reform, or to make sure that more immigrants have the right to vote, because people are contributing every day to our economy, and citizenship is really important. And so it's just interesting how my career has gone from being very for-profit centered to now very social justice oriented. So it's kind of an unusual career journey from an MBA perspective, from an MBA alum, but I'm very proud of the origins and the ways in which the Georgetown education has supported me throughout.
Yeah, that's a really interesting journey. And I feel like I have so many things I want to follow up on from that background. Thank you for sharing. Can you speak a little bit to that transition from client to employer, and particularly at that time, what was happening in Faith in Action and kind of the focus?
Sure, and it wasn't a totally straight path. They were my client, and then I stepped away, was still at Community Wealth Partners for a few years, and then I was recruited to join the team because Faith in Action was really growing quite rapidly and had hired a number of women of color, and both at the national level, we have a national network of organizations around the country, and we had been hiring and growing, and had a lot of new executive directors who were newer in their roles and needed more executive coaching type support. And so I was hired to both support folks at the national level, but also folks in our federations, and to create an organizational development, leadership development program that would support the executive directors, and to really ultimately support their retention. And it turns out when I was hired, it was in the midst of a lot of organizational turmoil, and folks were feeling in some ways that the organization hadn't created all of the necessary conditions for people to be successful. And so part of my role was really doing a lot of listening and understanding what were the ways that leaders wanted to be more supported, and what kinds of programs might we be able to create in order to support particularly staff and leaders of color. And so one of the things that I ended up taking on was creating a Black Women's Caucus as a way to build community among all of our Black women staff and leaders, which are about 80 or so out of our total team of about 300 people around the country. So that was a very rewarding experience to kind of create that kind of community within our network, and also created other programming focused on supporting new executive directors in particular to learn more about how to effectively operate their organizations kind of from an internal management perspective. So things like budgets and fundraising and accounting, all that fun stuff. So it's not the sexiest part of the job, but it's really important. And the nuts and bolts are ultimately what help the organization stay around for the long term.
And what would you say are the most encouraging parts of your work, and what do you love?
Yeah, well, I really love the opportunity to work with amazing colleagues every day. I mean, I'm really fortunate to work under the leadership now of Reverend Alvin Herring, who is had a really interesting career himself, and is really believes in creating an organization that is going to be like really the best possible place to work for people of color in the country. That's kind of his aspiration, and part of my role is really to support his leadership and vision in executing against that. And in some ways, what we think at Faith in Action is we want to try to create the kind of organization that sort of mirrors the type of society that we want in the world, and where folks can come to our organization and really live their highest and best aspirations for themselves through their work, but also contributing to kind of replicating that in society. So it's actually, it's really exciting. We see our organization as a little bit of a place to practice some of the things that we really want in society overall. And that includes, creating more space for people to take breaks when they need them. So like sabbaticals, and making sure that folks get access to really good kind of professional development opportunities, which varies depending on what role you're in. And we have so much more work to do to really fully live into this, but it's really exciting to be able to contribute to it.
Definitely. Speaking of breaks and sabbaticals, can you tell us a bit about how you manage your work life and personal life balance, and some tips there in a fast-paced world?
Well, I think what I've learned, and I live in Detroit, Michigan now, which is a very cold place, and the summers though are glorious, is that you really have to maximize figuring out like what it is that you love outside of work. And so for me, since I moved to Detroit about 5 years ago, I've really fallen in love with kayaking and exploring all of the different lakes and rivers in the Metro Detroit and kind of greater Michigan has just brought me so much joy. And during the pandemic, that was a real respite to be able to spend a lot of time outdoors and to have those kind of hobbies that sort of get me back into nature. And so that has been really grounding. And, just prioritizing time with family. I just spent a long weekend in San Francisco where I grew up and got to spend time with my little niece. And so just, making time for the people that you love. And I am not married and I don't have children. So for me, that looks maybe different than for somebody else. But I, just continue to, despite the pandemic, really try to make time for family and close friends and to stay grounded in kind of self-care practices that I know bring me a lot of joy.
That's great to hear. I also love kayaking, so great to
awesome.
hear it as well. I would be curious to hear what your thoughts and advice are on mentoring and how to find a mentor in the workplace.
Sure. Well, I agree. Mentoring is super, super important. And there's always so much that we can learn from folks who have kind of been in our shoes before, or whether in the same organization or elsewhere. And I think that one of the ways that I've been fortunate to be able to do this is that at Faith in Action, for example, there are some incredible women who are more experienced and have similar or different career trajectories, and reaching out to them for guidance and advice, or just to even check in periodically has just been so valuable. I actually had a call like that earlier today, and so I do think it's really important to kind of look out for who are the people in the organization that are role models in some way, and forging a relationship to help also see things that I might not be seeing, kind of even in my own leadership, and getting feedback or advice on how I can strengthen and grow for the future. And that's just been so valuable, especially when you build relationships with people that you can come to really trust and who want to support you in your success over the long term. And in turn, I also play a mentor role to folks, both inside and outside of the organization. And that's brought me a lot of joy too, to be able to share what I've learned with folks who are earlier in their career and maybe wrestling with some of the same things that I've wrestled with in the past. So, and I partially do that through board service. So I've had the opportunity to serve on boards and have had opportunities to mentor through that or through other volunteer activities.
So kind of a two-part question. One is, I'd love to hear about your most rewarding board experience. And then the second is, what do you think some of the biggest challenges that women face in the nonprofit sector? And how do you, obviously you mentioned the very successful caucus initiative that you put together. What are some other suggestions or ideas for how you think they can overcome those challenges?
In regards to the first question about the board experience, so I've served on the board of ProInspire, which is a DC-based leadership development nonprofit for almost, I think I'm going into my 7th year on the board, and it's been a really fascinating experience. I served as board chair and board vice chair for a period of time, and so I had an opportunity to really grow in my own leadership, and then had the opportunity to kind of transition out of that while staying on the board. And one of the things that we did was support the CEO, who was the founder of the organization, to grow into a shared leadership model. So now there's actually co-CEOs and the two leaders supporting them to both define their relationship, partner together, and they're a year into it to now do some reflection, like what's worked, what do we want to change going forward, has been super rewarding. And as a board member, I actually had to kind of get my hands into it by supporting the rewriting of our bylaws and our governance documents, making sure that that everything we wanted to do was actually, fully allowable by our operating documents. And so just really kind of getting into the weeds was like a really great learning experience for me. In terms of challenges for women in the nonprofit sector, I think one of the things is that like we often do this work because we love and are passionate about the mission of the organizations that we work with. And sometimes we end up doing that at a cost to our own, not to be too extreme about it, but sometimes we can get so into it, so immersed that we do forget to kind of take the time that we need for ourselves. And because often we feel very called to this work. And so I think, remembering to take space for ourselves, to do the regular pauses, to make sure we're focused on our self-care practices, I think is really important, because the work can be so grueling and sometimes you forget how much you're giving of yourself until somebody kind of reminds you and like reels you back, So, so I do think that just kind of remembering that even though we're passionate about this work, a lot of the work we're doing in the nonprofit sector is multi-generational work, that we've picked up the mantle from folks who came before us and we'll pass it down to folks who come after us. And that for the time that we're contributing, to do our best, but to also make sure that we're equally as passionate about other things in our lives besides work. So, yeah.
We have just a couple minutes left, so I'm going to squeeze in one last question. Cura Personalis is a very central part of Georgetown's mission. We have a lot of MBAs that go into atypical careers. What do you think about the MBA skills and their applicability to the nonprofit sector and what they can bring?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think about Cura Personalis regularly in terms of, caring for the whole person. And I think the nonprofit sector is a place where you really get to feel like you're doing that every day as part of my job. And I think what's been interesting is actually thinking about how do I transform a lot of the skills that I learned in the MBA program and apply them to the nonprofit sector kind of in a way that doesn't necessarily replicate kind of like capitalism or patriarchy or some of the other things that like traditional business school teaching kind of might lead you to continue to practice. So sometimes, like, for example, working in an organization that's now majority people of color and where capitalism is sometimes seen as at odds with what we're trying to bring about in the world. Like, how do I actually think about, okay, but we still need really strong organizational practices. And so like, how do we think about what can we take from hierarchy, but maybe think about how to transform that into an organizational structure that is a little bit more egalitarian or allows for more collective decision-making. And so there's things that I may have learned at Georgetown that I'm now kind of thinking about, okay, how do I apply that, but with a lens towards different kinds of outcomes, or there might even be some things I learned at Georgetown that I'm kind of actively unlearning, and that's okay too, because it's all part of a journey and a process. And so I think, like, for example, profit is not the motive that we care the most about. So like, what are some of our other motives that we're motivated by, and how do we prioritize those? And when we think about the results and the decision making that leads to those results. So I know it's kind of a tricky question, but I am, really excited that there are so many of us from Georgetown who have chosen these more atypical careers, and that there's lots and lots and lots of paths from the MBA program. And I think that's really exciting.
Yeah, definitely. I wish we had more time. Isabelle Moses, Chief of Staff, Faith in Action, thank you so much for joining us.
All right. Well, thank you. Appreciate it. And best wishes with the rest of the year.